Hey guys! Tonight, we're going to wander gently through history's attic, the dusty corner where the facts sound completely made up. The kind of stories that make you blink twice and say, that can't be right. But, unfortunately for everyone involved, they are very right. So dim the lights. Get comfortable. Maybe fluff that pillow that's been betraying your neck. And let's ease into 10 historical facts that sound fake, but are absolutely true. We'll start in Spain. Because of course we will. Let's talk about Charles II of Spain. Now, Charles II was born in 1661 into the Habsburg dynasty. And if you know anything about the Habsburgs, you already feel slightly concerned. The family tree did not branch. It gently folded inward, like a lawn chair. 4 generations, the Habsburgs married cousins. First cousins, double cousins, nieces, uncles. If there was a family reunion, it doubled as a dating pool, which, medically speaking, is not ideal. By the time Charles II arrived, the genetic deck had been shuffled one too many times. His family tree looked less like a tree and more like a wreath. Charles had what historians politely call extensive physical and mental disabilities. What that means in calmer bedtime terms is that the poor man struggled with almost everything. He couldn't chew properly. His famous Habsburg jaw was so pronounced that his teeth didn't line up. Eating was difficult. Speaking was difficult. Existing seemed, frankly, exhausting. He didn't walk until he was about 8 years old. 8. Most toddlers are already emotionally manipulating their parents by then. His tongue was so large he reportedly struggled to talk clearly. Foreign ambassadors described him in ways that were not kind. One wrote that he looked more dead than alive. And yet he was king, because bloodline mattered more than literally anything else. Charles was also believed to be cursed, which feels unfair. It wasn't a curse. It was centuries of strategic cousin enthusiasm. Physicians tried everything. They gave him strange potions. They performed exorcisms. Because if your king can't produce an heir and also seems permanently unwell, obviously the problem is demons. Spoiler, it was not demons. Charles married twice. Both marriages were, shall we say, diplomatically motivated. Neither produced children. His body simply couldn't manage it. When he died in 1700 at age 38, his autopsy revealed that he had one testicle. His heart was reportedly the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were rotting. And his head was filled with fluid. So yes, the King of Spain was essentially held together by ceremony and hope. And his death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession. Because of course Europe decided to have a massive war over who would inherit the world's most exhausted throne. All because one dynasty couldn't stop marrying itself. History lesson number 1, if your family tree is starting to look like a circle, maybe reconsider. Now, let's gently drift north to Russia and meet a man who decided to tax facial hair. Peter the Great. Peter I of Russia was tall, very tall. Around 6 feet 8 inches, which in the 17th century made him look like he was photoshopped into real life. He had big energy, restless energy, the kind of energy that says, I'm going to modernize this entire country whether it likes it or not. Peter loved Western Europe. He thought Russia was backward. So he traveled incognito across Europe to learn shipbuilding, science, military tactics, and probably fashion criticism. When he returned home, he decided Russia needed a makeover. And nothing says modern nation like banning beards. Peter associated beards with old traditions and religious conservatism. Western Europe was clean-shaven. Therefore, Russia would be clean-shaven. Except many Russian men saw beards as a symbol of masculinity and faith. So Peter did what any reasonable autocrat would do. He taxed them. If you wanted to keep your beard, you had to pay a beard tax. After paying, you received a small token coin proving you were legally bearded. Imagine carrying a beard license in your pocket. There were different tax rates depending on your social class. Nobles paid more. Peasants paid less. Clergy were sometimes exempt. Bureaucracy, but make it facial. Some men refused. Peter would sometimes personally cut their beards off. Because when you're 6 feet 8 inches and emotionally committed to smooth faces, you take matters into your own hands. It sounds fake. It feels fake. But for decades, Russia had an official beard tax. And that's not even Peter's weirdest decision. He also moved the capital to a swamp, founded St. Petersburg, forced nobles to build houses there. Thousands of laborers died constructing it, all because Peter wanted a window to the West. History is full of men with vision, and occasionally that vision involves wetlands. Let's float over now to France, specifically to a time when people were terrified of potatoes. Yes, potatoes. In 18th century France, many believed potatoes caused disease. They were ugly. They grew underground, which, in fairness, does give slightly suspicious energy. The French Parliament even banned potato cultivation in 1748, because clearly this lumpy vegetable was plotting something. Enter Antoine-Augustin Parmentier. Parmentier had been imprisoned during the 7 Years' War. In prison, he was fed potatoes. And he didn't die. In fact, he was fine. So he returned to France, convinced that potatoes could solve famine. But how do you convince a nation that thinks potatoes are demonic dirt lumps? Simple. Reverse psychology. Parmentier planted potato fields near Paris. Then he hired guards to protect them during the day. At night, he told the guards to look away. Naturally, people assumed anything heavily guarded must be valuable. So they snuck in and stole the potatoes. Exactly as planned. Soon potatoes spread across France, including to a certain Napoleon Bonaparte, who reportedly supported their cultivation. So yes, France was tricked into liking potatoes because someone staged a fake security operation. Marketing. 18th century edition. Now, let's drift gently toward England, where we meet a woman who survived something that sounds entirely fictional. Margery Kempe. Margery lived in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. She's often described as the author of the first autobiography in English. But that's not the weird part. Margery claimed she had intense religious visions, conversations with Jesus, loud public weeping, dramatic pilgrimages. At one point, she described negotiating with her husband to live in celibacy. After having 14 children. 14. Imagine raising 14 medieval children and then deciding you'd like to pivot into mysticism. Margery would burst into tears during church services. Loudly. Dramatically. Repeatedly. She became known for uncontrollable crying. Many people thought she was possessed. Or faking. Or just extremely committed to emotional expression. She was tried for heresy multiple times, and somehow talked her way out of execution each time, which is honestly impressive. She traveled across Europe and the Middle East on pilgrimage, in an era when travel was dangerous, slow, and wildly uncomfortable, all while loudly crying about divine love. It sounds like performance art, but it was very real. Margery dictated her life story to scribes later in life. The manuscript was lost for centuries and rediscovered in the 1930s. So yes, a medieval mother of 14 reinvented herself as a globe-trotting mystic influencer. Before influencing was a thing. And we love that for her. Let's gently pivot to Sweden, where we meet King Charles XII, a man who refused to sit down. Charles XII became king at age 15, which is already concerning. Teenage kings rarely scream stability. He spent most of his reign at war during the Great Northern War. But here's the strange part. Charles reportedly avoided luxury. He slept on the floor. He rarely sat on thrones. He wore simple uniforms. He disliked court ceremony. He also refused to marry, which made succession planning awkward. He was intensely disciplined, possibly to the point of self-denial. He once allegedly remained standing for hours while conducting business, because chairs were apparently suspicious. He led troops personally into battle. He was shot multiple times. Survived. Kept going. It sounds exaggerated, but contemporary sources confirm he genuinely avoided comfort. Eventually, he was shot in the head during a siege in 1718, and historians still debate who fired the fatal bullet. But we won't dwell there. Remember, sleepy vibes. Instead, just imagine being a Swedish courtier, trying to convince your king to please just sit down. And he refuses. History is exhausting. And we're only just getting started. So take a slow breath. We've met a king undone by his own bloodline, a czar who taxed beards, a nation terrified of potatoes, a crying medieval mystic mom, and a Swedish king who treated chairs like moral weakness. And that's just part one. In the next stretch, we'll glide into exploding molasses, dancing plagues, and a Roman emperor who declared war on the sea. Because yes, that happened too. But for now, just let your brain float gently through the strange comfort of historical absurdity. Part 2. The Emperor Who Fought the Ocean. All right. Welcome back. If you're still awake, that's impressive. If you're drifting somewhere between consciousness and medieval potato propaganda, that's perfect. We're going to continue our gentle stroll through history's This Cannot Be Real folder. And now we arrive in ancient Rome. Because of course we do. Let's talk about Caligula, officially known as Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. But Caligula stuck. It means little boot, which was a nickname he got as a child while accompanying his father on military campaigns. Nothing says future emperor like being known for tiny footwear. Caligula became emperor in 37 CE. At first, Rome loved him. He was young, charismatic. The people thought, finally, a normal one. That optimism aged poorly. Caligula fell seriously ill early in his reign. Some historians think it may have been encephalitis. After he recovered, things shifted. He grew erratic, paranoid, grandiose, which, to be fair, is a dangerous combination when you're in charge of the Roman Empire. Now here's the fact that sounds fake. Caligula declared war on Neptune. Yes, the sea. According to Roman historian Suetonius, Caligula assembled his troops along the coast of Gaul. They were prepared for a military campaign, possibly an invasion of Britain. Instead, Caligula ordered them to attack the waves. Soldiers reportedly stabbed the water, threw spears into the surf, collected seashells as spoils of war. He declared victory over Neptune, god of the sea, which is bold, because the ocean does not care. Some modern historians argue this may have been misunderstood satire, or a symbolic exercise, or a logistical breakdown. But ancient sources are very clear. At some point, Roman soldiers were aggressively poking the tide. Caligula also allegedly planned to make his horse a consul. His horse's name was Incitatus. The animal reportedly had a marble stable, an ivory manger, fine jewelry. Was he actually going to appoint the horse to high office? Or was it political trolling? Hard to say. But it's deeply Roman to be both absurd and terrifying at the same time. Caligula ruled for just under 4 years. He was assassinated in 41 CE by members of the Praetorian Guard. Because even Rome has limits. Let's float forward to 1518, and gently arrive in Strasbourg, where people just started dancing. This is known as the dancing plague of 1518. One woman, Frau Trophia, began dancing in the street. Not celebratory dancing, not festive dancing, just non-stop dancing. For days. Soon others joined. Within weeks, hundreds of people were dancing uncontrollably. Some sources say up to 400. They danced until they collapsed. Some reportedly died from exhaustion, heart attacks, or strokes. City authorities panicked. Their solution? More dancing. Doctors believed it was caused by hot blood. So they hired musicians, built a stage, encouraged sufferers to dance it out, which feels like telling someone with a migraine to listen to louder drums. Eventually, the epidemic subsided. Modern theories range from ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic mold found in rye, to mass psychogenic illness. But the image remains. Hundreds of medieval people dancing against their will, in the summer heat, while city officials said, maybe add more music? History is gentle chaos. Now, let's drift to 1919. Boston. Molasses. Yes, molasses. On January 15, 1919, a massive storage tank filled with molasses burst. The tank was 50 feet tall. It held over 2 million gallons of molasses. When it ruptured, a 25-foot wave of sticky syrup surged through the streets at an estimated 35 miles per hour. Imagine being in Boston, just minding your business, and suddenly dessert attacks. Buildings were crushed. Horses drowned. 21 people died. Over 150 were injured. Rescue workers struggled because everything was coated in thick, slow-moving sugar sludge. The molasses eventually fermented in the sun. The area reportedly smelled sweet for years. Some locals claim that on hot days, you can still smell faint molasses, which is both charming and deeply unsettling. The Great Molasses Flood sounds like satire. It was not. It was industrial negligence, but make it pancake topping. Let's gently wander into the 19th century and meet Mary Toft. Mary Toft lived in England in the 1720s. She became famous for an unusual medical condition. She claimed to give birth to rabbits. Yes, rabbits. Doctors were summoned. They examined her and reportedly delivered small rabbit parts from her body. Several respected physicians believed her. King George I even sent his own surgeon to investigate. For weeks, this continued. Rabbits. Partial rabbits. Suspicious rabbits. Eventually, it was revealed that Mary had been inserting rabbit remains into herself to fake the births, which is a sentence I did not expect to say tonight. She was exposed. The doctors were humiliated. The public was fascinated. It sounds like tabloid fiction, but it was one of the most famous medical hoaxes of the 18th century, and it gently reminds us that early modern medicine was trying. Now, let's glide toward the Ottoman Empire, specifically to Sultan Ibrahim I, known as Ibrahim the Mad, which already feels like a warning label. Ibrahim became Sultan in 1640. He had spent much of his life confined in the caves, a palace prison designed to prevent royal siblings from murdering each other for the throne, which, ironically, probably did not improve mental health outcomes. Ibrahim developed some fixations. He was obsessed with fur, particularly sable fur. He lined rooms with it, wore it constantly. He also reportedly developed an intense fascination with larger women. According to some accounts, he ordered officials to find the heaviest woman in the empire. They found a woman nicknamed Sugar Cube. She allegedly weighed around 330 pounds. He became enamored, showered her with gifts, which sounds like gossip, and may be exaggerated by hostile sources. But what is clear is that Ibrahim's rule was unstable. He executed officials impulsively, made erratic financial decisions. At one point, he allegedly ordered the drowning of 280 concubines on suspicion of infidelity. Historians debate the accuracy of that number. Ottoman court politics were brutal, and sources were often dramatic. Eventually, he was deposed and executed in 1648. The empire decided perhaps a slightly calmer energy was needed. Let's gently transition to Australia. In 1932, where humans declared war on birds, specifically emus. This is known as the Great Emu War. After World War I, Australian soldiers were given farmland. Unfortunately, large populations of emus migrated into these areas. The birds destroyed crops. Farmers were frustrated, so the government deployed soldiers armed with machine guns against emus. The birds were surprisingly resilient. They scattered. They ran fast. They were hard to hit. One machine gun reportedly jammed. Another time, soldiers mounted a gun on a truck, which broke down. After thousands of rounds fired, the emu population remained strong. Eventually, the military withdrew. Officially, the emus won, which is a delightful sentence. Humans, 0. Large flightless birds, 1. History contains multitudes. And mild embarrassment. Now take a slow breath. We've watched Rome fight the ocean. Medieval Europe dance itself into collapse. Boston drown in molasses. Doctors believe in rabbit births. An Ottoman sultan redecorate with fur. And Australia lose a war to birds. All completely real. And we're only halfway through our strange parade of truth. In Part 3, we'll drift into exploding coffins, presidential ghosts, and a man who survived 2 atomic bombs. Because history does not believe in subtlety. For now, just let your thoughts move slowly, like molasses, but significantly less fatal. Part 3. The man who survived the end of the world. Twice. All right. Welcome back again. If your brain is starting to feel pleasantly foggy, that's exactly the goal. We are not here for adrenaline. We are here for mildly unbelievable facts delivered at the speed of a sleepy tortoise. So, let's glide into one of the most astonishing true stories of the 20th century. Meet Tsutomu Yamaguchi. Yamaguchi was a Japanese engineer working for Mitsubishi. In the summer of 1945, he was on a business trip in Hiroshima. On August 6, 1945, he was preparing to leave the city when he saw something in the sky. A plane. Then a flash. A blinding flash. The atomic bomb little boy detonated over Hiroshima. Yamaguchi was about 2 miles from ground zero. The explosion knocked him into a potato field. He suffered severe burns on his upper body. His eardrums ruptured. He was temporarily blinded. It sounds like the end of the story, but it is not. After spending the night in a bomb shelter, he boarded a train the next day and returned home to Nagasaki, because of course he did. On August 9th, 1945, while reporting to his supervisor about the devastation he had witnessed in Hiroshima, another flash filled the sky. The second atomic bomb, Fat Man, detonated over Nagasaki. Yamaguchi survived again. He suffered additional injuries, radiation exposure, and years of health complications. But he lived until 2010. In 2009, the Japanese government officially recognized him as a double hibakusha, a survivor of both atomic bombings. It sounds like fiction, like an improbable screenplay, but it is very real. Sometimes history whispers, statistically impossible, and then does it anyway. Now let's gently pivot to the United States, where we will meet a president and his ghost. Abraham Lincoln is perhaps the most mythologized American president. Tall, thoughtful, burdened by civil war. But here's the strange part. Lincoln reportedly held seances in the White House. After the death of his son Willie in 1862, Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, were devastated. Grief, especially in the 19th century, often blended with spiritualism. Spiritualism was wildly popular at the time. People believed the dead could communicate with the living through mediums. Mary Todd Lincoln became deeply involved. She hosted seances at the White House. Mediums claimed to contact Willie. There are accounts suggesting Lincoln himself attended at least a few of these sessions. Imagine the President of the United States sitting in a dim room, hands joined, waiting for ghostly messages. It feels cinematic, slightly gothic, but spiritualism was mainstream at the time. Senators, generals, socialites, many believed. And grief makes people reach for comfort wherever they can find it. Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, of course. And here's where the story gets even more strange. Multiple White House residents over the decades have claimed to see Lincoln's ghost. Winston Churchill reportedly encountered Lincoln's apparition while staying at the White House during World War II. The story goes that Churchill had just finished a bath. He was smoking a cigar, naked, as one does. And there, by the fireplace, stood Abraham Lincoln. Churchill supposedly said, "Good evening, Mr. President. You seem to have me at a disadvantage." Which is either the most British response in history or a very polite hallucination. True? Unprovable, but widely repeated. History likes to linger. Now, let's drift to 19th century England again and meet the woman whose coffin kept exploding. Yes, exploding. Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein, is not our focus here, though that would fit. Instead, we're talking about a lesser-known phenomenon of the 1800s, exploding coffins. In the 19th century, coffins were often sealed tightly to prevent odors. Unfortunately, when bodies decompose, gases build up. And if there is nowhere for those gases to escape, pressure increases, sometimes dramatically. There are documented cases of coffins bursting open during funerals or transport. One particularly famous example occurred in 1844 in London, when a sealed coffin exploded during a funeral procession, horrifying attendees. This led to innovations like safety coffins and improved burial practices. So yes, Victorian funerals occasionally included unexpected sound effects. Not ideal. Let's float over now to medieval Paris, where we meet the Cadaver Synod. In 897 CE, Pope Formosus had already died. He had been buried for several months. His successor, Pope Stephen VI, decided that wasn't enough. He ordered Formosus's corpse exhumed. The body was dressed in papal robes, propped up on a throne, and put on trial. Yes, a literal corpse trial. A deacon was appointed to speak on behalf of the dead pope. Stephen accused the corpse of perjury and illegally assuming the papacy. The cadaver, unsurprisingly, offered no defense. Formosus was found guilty. His papal acts were declared invalid. His fingers of blessing were cut off. The body was thrown into the Tiber River. The public was unsettled. Stephen VI was eventually overthrown and imprisoned. He died not long after. The Cadaver Synod sounds like satire written by someone who dislikes organized religion. But it happened. Medieval politics were occasionally theatrical. Now, let's drift into something slightly more wholesome. Sort of. In 1826, two former U.S. presidents died on the same day. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. July 4th. The 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Both men had been rivals, then allies, then pen pals in old age. On his deathbed, Adams reportedly said, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He was mistaken. Jefferson had died earlier that same day. The symmetry feels scripted. Too neat. Too poetic. But it is true. History occasionally aligns itself like a stage play. Now take a slow breath. We've encountered a man who survived 2 atomic bombs. A president who attended seances. Coffins with dramatic timing. A dead pope put on trial. And 2 founding fathers exiting on cue. All completely real. And yet sounding like bedtime fiction. We have one final stretch ahead in this strange parade of reality. In Part 4, we'll gently wander into a time when Coca-Cola contained actual cocaine, a town that elected a dog as mayor, and a medieval king who literally exploded from overeating. Because why not end on that note? Settle deeper into the pillow. We're almost there. Part 4. Soda, dogs, and a king who overdid lunch.
All right.
Welcome back for our final gentle glide through history's There Is Absolutely No Way collection. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You have now mentally survived exploding molasses, corpse trials, beard taxes, and a war on birds. Your brain deserves a soft blanket. Let's begin this last stretch with something surprisingly fizzy. Coca-Cola.
Yes.
That Coca-Cola. When it was invented in 1886 by John Stith Pemberton, a pharmacist in Atlanta, it actually contained cocaine. Not a metaphor. Not a rumor. Actual cocaine. The drink was marketed as a medicinal tonic. It was meant to cure headaches, fatigue, and possibly existential dread. The name itself came from 2 key ingredients, coca leaves and cola nuts. Coca leaves contain cocaine. Now, before we imagine Victorian office workers bouncing off the walls, it's important to note that the amount was relatively small. And cocaine was legal at the time. It appeared in various medicines. People were sprinkling it into products with a confidence that feels ambitious. By the early 1900s, growing concerns about addiction led to the removal of cocaine from Coca-Cola's formula. Today, the company still uses coca leaves, but the cocaine is extracted first, which feels like a wise compromise. So yes, your great-great-grandparents may have been sipping lightly narcotic soda while reading the newspaper. History is bubbly. Now, let's drift to Talkeetna, Alaska. A small town.
Scenic.
Quiet. The kind of place where moose occasionally have more authority than people. In 1997, the town elected a dog as honorary mayor. His name was Stubbs. Stubbs was a ginger cat, actually not a dog. And that makes it even better. There was reportedly dissatisfaction with the human candidates in a local election. So some residents wrote in Stubbs as a joke. And he won. Stubbs served as honorary mayor for about 20 years. He greeted tourists, sat in local shops, drank water from a wine glass at community events. He did not pass legislation. He did not draft budgets. But he had approval ratings most politicians would envy. Stubbs became a symbol of the town, a furry ambassador. He survived an attack by a dog. Fell into a deep fryer once he recovered. Lived a full life. He died in 2017 at age 20. It sounds like an internet meme. It was not. Sometimes democracy just shrugs and says, sure, why not the cat? Now, let's move back in time.
To England.
To King Henry I. Henry I ruled from 1100 to 1135. He was the youngest son of William the Conqueror. Not originally expected to be king, but medieval succession was less orderly than we pretend. Henry was known for administrative reforms, legal systems, fiscal oversight. But what people often remember is how he died. According to chroniclers, Henry died after eating too many lampreys. Lampreys are eel-like fish.
Slimy. Jawless.
Slightly prehistoric looking. Apparently a delicacy. Henry had been advised by his physicians to avoid eating them. which, as history repeatedly shows, is basically an invitation. He ignored the advice, ate a large quantity of lampreys, and fell ill shortly afterward. Some historians believe it may have been food poisoning. Others suspect underlying illness. But the chroniclers were very clear. The king ate too many weird eels. And that was that. It feels almost anticlimactic. No dramatic battlefield. No assassination. Just seafood enthusiasm. And honestly, it's kind of relatable. Let's gently slide to France again. To the 19th century, where we meet a man named Tarare. Tarare was a French showman and soldier with an extraordinary appetite. He could eat enormous quantities of food, entire baskets of apples,
Whole cats.
live eels. Yes, live eels. He reportedly had an unusually large mouth and stomach. His body temperature was high. He was constantly hungry. During the French Revolutionary Wars, he was used as a courier. He would swallow messages sealed in small boxes, travel across enemy lines, and retrieve them later. It worked. Sometimes. At one point, after being captured by the Prussians and forced to prove his abilities, he was released. Because even the enemy found him disturbing. Tarare's appetite became increasingly alarming. Hospital staff accused him of drinking patients' blood. There were rumors about missing toddlers. Though these stories may have been exaggerated, he died in his 20s from tuberculosis. His autopsy revealed an enlarged esophagus and stomach. He sounds like folklore. He was documented. History occasionally produces people who feel mythic, and then leaves us with medical reports to confirm it. Now, let's gently approach our final fact. In 1978, a man named Georgy Markov was assassinated in London. Markov was a Bulgarian dissident. He had criticized the Bulgarian government from abroad. One day, while waiting at a bus stop, he felt a sharp pain in his leg. He turned and saw a man picking up an umbrella. The man apologized. Within days, Markov was dead. Doctors later discovered a tiny metal pellet embedded in his leg. It contained ricin, a deadly toxin. The umbrella had been modified to inject the pellet. Yes, an umbrella weapon. It sounds like a spy novel written by someone who got carried away. But it was real. Cold War espionage had flair. The Bulgarian umbrella became infamous. Sometimes history wears a trench coat.
Now.
Take one last slow breath. We've traveled across centuries. Met kings undone by genetics. Emperors fighting oceans. People dancing without stopping. Presidents hosting seances. Towns electing cats. And soda once laced with cocaine. Every single one of these stories sounds slightly fabricated. And yet they happened. History is not tidy. It is not logical. It is not even particularly subtle. It is human. And humans are strange. As you drift off tonight, maybe let that thought settle gently. Somewhere in some archive, there is a document calmly recording something that sounds impossible. And someday, someone will read it and whisper, "There is no way." But there was.
All right.
That's enough reality for one evening. Dim the lights a little lower. Let your mind wander slowly through centuries of quiet absurdity. And I'll see you next time.
See.
Part 5. The Man Who Sold the Eiffel Tower.
Twice. All right.
You're still here, which means either you're deeply committed to history or you fell asleep and woke up very confused about umbrella assassinations. Either way, welcome back. We're not done. History never really is. Let's drift softly into early 20th century Paris. The Eiffel Tower had been standing since 1889. At first, many Parisians hated it. They called it ugly, industrial, a giant metal asparagus ruining the skyline. By the 1920s, it was beloved, iconic, very much not for sale, which makes what happened next feel bold. Enter Victor Lustig. Lustig was a con artist, not a small-time pickpocket, a refined, multilingual, suit-wearing professional scammer. In 1925, he read in the newspaper that the Eiffel Tower required expensive maintenance. He saw opportunity. Lustig forged government documents. He invited several scrap metal dealers to a private meeting at a luxury hotel. He posed as a government official. He calmly explained that the French government planned to dismantle the Eiffel Tower and sell it for scrap, but wanted to avoid public outcry. The dealers were sworn to secrecy. Imagine sitting in a fancy hotel room being told, very seriously, that you could purchase the Eiffel Tower. One man, André Poisson, was hesitant. Lustig sensed insecurity and subtly implied that a bribe might help secure the deal. Poisson paid. Lustig took the money and quietly left for Austria. And here's the truly unbelievable part. Poisson was so embarrassed that he didn't report the crime. So Lustig came back to Paris and tried it again. The second attempt failed, but the audacity remains. He later moved to the United States and continued conning people, even selling a money-printing machine. He was eventually arrested and died in Alcatraz in 1947.
But yes.
A man once sold the Eiffel Tower.
Twice.
Let's float over now to ancient Greece. To a philosopher who decided society wasn't for him. Diogenes of Sinope. Diogenes was a cynic philosopher in the 4th century BC. And when we say cynic, we mean original recipe cynic. He believed in radical simplicity, rejected wealth, rejected social norms. He lived in a large ceramic jar, often described as a barrel. He wandered Athens during the day carrying a lantern. When asked why, he reportedly said, "I am looking for an honest man," which is both philosophical and deeply shady. Diogenes publicly mocked powerful figures, including Alexander the Great. According to legend, Alexander once visited him and asked if there was anything he could do for him. Diogenes replied, "Yes. Stand out of my sunlight." Alexander was reportedly so impressed he said, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." To which Diogenes probably shrugged. He also advocated for living like a dog, which is where the term cynic comes from, kynikos, meaning dog-like. He ate simply, slept outside, and was arrested for counterfeiting at one point. He sounds like a modern performance artist who wandered into the wrong century. But he was real. Sometimes history's most radical thinkers just wanted better lighting. Now, let's glide toward medieval England again. Because medieval England refuses to behave normally. In 1251, King Henry III received a gift from Norway. A polar bear.
Yes.
A fully grown polar bear. It was a diplomatic gift from King Haakon IV of Norway. Henry III kept the bear in the Tower of London. And here's the delightful part. The bear was allowed to fish in the River Thames. It was kept on a long chain and reportedly swam in the river to catch fish. Imagine strolling through London in the 13th century and seeing a polar bear casually doing its afternoon fishing. Completely normal. Medieval zoos were less carefully curated habitat and more surprise Arctic visitor. Now, let's gently move to the 16th century, to a time when people believed tomatoes were poisonous. Tomatoes were brought to Europe from the Americas in the 1500s, but many Europeans refused to eat them.
Why?
Because wealthy people used pewter plates. Pewter contained lead. Tomatoes are acidic. When placed on pewter, they leached lead from the plate. People ate the tomatoes, got sick from lead poisoning, and blamed the fruit. Thus, tomatoes were considered dangerous for centuries in parts of Europe. It sounds like culinary paranoia, but it was chemistry and slightly unfortunate tableware. Now, let's drift into the Victorian era and meet the Great Stink. London, 1858. The summer was hot, very hot. The River Thames was essentially an open sewer. Raw waste flowed directly into it. As temperatures rose, the smell intensified. Parliament was located right by the river. Members of Parliament tried to continue working. They soaked curtains in chloride of lime to mask the odor. It did not work. The smell was overwhelming. Eventually, Parliament adjourned because it was simply too smelly to govern, which feels like a metaphor. The crisis led to the construction of London's modern sewer system, designed by engineer Joseph Bazalgette.
So yes.
An entire government once paused because the vibes were too foul. Sometimes infrastructure improvements begin with collective nausea. Now, let's float gently toward the American frontier. In 1835, the city of Toledo, Ohio, went to war with Michigan. The Toledo War. It was a border dispute over a strip of land. Militias were mobilized. Shots were fired. No one was killed. Eventually, the U.S. government intervened. Michigan received statehood, but had to give up the disputed strip. In exchange, it received the Upper Peninsula. At the time, many considered the Upper Peninsula worthless wilderness. It later turned out to contain rich mineral deposits.
So yes.
A near war over Ohio ended with Michigan accidentally winning long-term. History occasionally rewards patience. Let's gently approach something stranger still. In 1814, a massive beer flood swept through London. At the Moore and Company Brewery, a giant vat containing over 135,000 gallons of porter burst. The pressure caused other vats to rupture. Over 320,000 gallons of beer flooded the surrounding streets. Houses collapsed. 8 people died. The brewery was taken to court. But the disaster was ruled an act of God, which feels like a generous interpretation.
So yes.
Before molasses, there was beer. History clearly enjoys liquid chaos.
Now,
we'll close this section with something quietly poetic. In 1896, 2 cars collided in New York City. This was the first recorded automobile accident in the United States. There were only a handful of cars in the entire city. And yet, they found each other. Like destiny. It sounds like a punchline, but it's just probability being mildly sarcastic. Take a slow breath. We've sold monuments. Lived in barrels. Part 6. Lions, lightning, and the man who would not rot. All right. Settle in again. Maybe adjust the blanket. Maybe turn the pillow over to the cool side. History will still be strange when you come back. We've already had corpse trials and umbrella weapons. So at this point, your brain is probably just nodding politely like, sure. Of course that happened.
good.
Let's begin tonight's gentle descent with a Roman emperor and his pet lion. Because subtlety was never Rome's strongest quality. Meet Emperor Commodus. Commodus ruled from 180 to 192 CE. He was the son of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, which is already a tough act to follow. Imagine being raised by Stoicism itself. Commodus did not continue the philosopher vibe. He preferred gladiator cosplay. He adored the arena. He fought in staged gladiator contests against wounded animals or very unlucky opponents who were instructed not to win. He renamed Rome after himself. Briefly, because why not? And yes, he kept exotic animals, including lions. There are accounts of Commodus personally entering the arena to slaughter dozens of animals at once. Safely arranged, of course. It was less brave warrior and more imperial theater production. He charged the Roman treasury for these performances. Imagine paying taxes so your emperor can role-play Hercules in front of 50,000 people. Eventually, members of his inner circle decided this was unsustainable. He was assassinated in 192 CE. The Senate reportedly declared him a public enemy. Rome had a habit of loving emperors until it absolutely didn't. Now, let's drift to something quieter. Something oddly peaceful. Lightning. In 1769, a man named Giovanni Battista Beccaria, a physicist, not Cesare Beccaria the philosopher, conducted experiments with electricity. This was the era when electricity was mysterious and fashionable. Benjamin Franklin had already flown his kite. People were electrifying frogs and wigs. But here's the strange part. In 1753, Russian scientist George Wilhelm Richman attempted to study lightning by attracting it during a storm. He set up metal rods connected to measuring devices. Lightning struck and killed him instantly. He became one of the first recorded fatalities from electrical experimentation. It sounds like a cautionary tale invented by a science teacher, but it happened. Sometimes the Enlightenment was very enthusiastic. Now, let's float toward medieval Italy and meet the incorruptibles. In Catholic tradition, there are certain saints whose bodies reportedly did not decompose after death. One famous example is Saint Cecilia. When her tomb was opened in 1599, over 1,000 years after her death, observers claimed her body appeared remarkably preserved. Similar claims exist for other saints, Saint Bernadette of Lourdes, for example, whose body was exhumed multiple times and found in a preserved state. Modern science often attributes these cases to natural mummification, environmental conditions, or preservation techniques. But at the time, incorruptibility was seen as a divine sign. It sounds mythical, but there are real documented exhumations, medical examinations, and glass reliquaries displaying preserved remains. History sometimes places the miraculous gently next to the medical report. Now, let's move to something almost charming. In 1386, in the French town of Falaise, a pig was put on trial.
Yes.
A pig. The animal had attacked and killed a child. Medieval Europe occasionally held animal trials. Pigs, rats, even insects were summoned to court. The pig in Falaise was dressed in human clothing and formally tried. It was found guilty and executed. This sounds like satire written by someone mocking medieval justice. But records of animal trials are well documented. The logic was that animals, as part of God's creation, were subject to moral law, which feels ambitious. Now we'll drift gently into the 20th century again, to a moment of remarkable calm. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world was balancing on the edge of nuclear war. On October 27th, a Soviet submarine named B-59 was near Cuba. U.S. forces dropped depth charges to force it to surface. The submarine had a nuclear torpedo on board. The captain believed war may have already begun. He wanted to launch the torpedo. Launching required agreement from 3 officers. 2 agreed. The third, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. He argued against firing. He convinced the others to surface instead. The torpedo was never launched. Historians widely believe Arkhipov's decision may have prevented nuclear war, which means at one quiet moment underwater, one person said, "Maybe not." And the world continued. It sounds dramatic, but it was simply restraint. Now, let's gently wander to something delightfully petty. In 1903, a man named Horatio Nelson Jackson made a bet. He wagered that he could drive a car across the United States. At the time, there were barely any paved roads. Gas stations were not a thing. Jackson had never driven a car before. He hired the mechanic, bought a car, and set off from San Francisco. The journey took 63 days. The car broke down constantly. They got lost. They ran out of fuel repeatedly. At one point, They adopted a bulldog named Bud, who wore goggles to protect his eyes from dust. Bud became one of the first dogs to ride cross-country in an automobile. They eventually reached New York. Jackson won the bet. He did not attempt the trip again. Sometimes one chaotic road trip is enough. Now, let's ease into something quietly eerie. In 1912, Swedish explorer Salomon August André attempted to reach the North Pole by hydrogen balloon. The plan was ambitious, slightly optimistic. The balloon launched. It drifted off course, landed on Arctic ice. André and his two companions attempted to trek across the ice. They disappeared for 33 years. In 1930, their remains were discovered on a remote island. Alongside them were undeveloped photographs. The film was recovered. The images showed their journey, camp life, sleds, the balloon wreckage. Frozen in time. It feels cinematic, but it was real. Sometimes history waits quietly under ice. Now, let's end this section with something oddly mundane. In 1977, NASA launched the Voyager probes. Each carries a golden record, a phonograph record containing sounds and images from Earth. Greetings in 55 languages. Music from Bach to Chuck Berry. The sound of a kiss. Laughter. If extraterrestrials ever find Voyager, they will encounter humanity's mixtape, which is both beautiful and slightly awkward. The spacecraft are still traveling. They will outlast Earth's continents. Somewhere in deep space, there is a small golden record carrying proof that we once argued about tomatoes and elected cats as mayors. Part 7. Time slips, talking horses, and the town that tried to ban fun. All right, we're back. If you're listening to this at 2 a.m., slightly confused about why medieval pigs had better legal representation than some modern citizens, that's okay. History is weird. You're doing great. Let's begin with something that feels like science fiction. In 1901, two English women, Charlotte and Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, visited the Palace of Versailles in France. Just a normal sightseeing trip. At some point while wandering the gardens, they later claimed that something felt off. They described encountering people in old-fashioned clothing. They said the air felt heavy, still, almost painted. One woman claimed she saw Marie Antoinette sitting and sketching. The two later wrote a book called An Adventure, in which they suggested they had experienced a time slip, briefly stepping back into 18th century France. Now, historians and psychologists have proposed many explanations. Misinterpretation, memory distortion, suggestion, romantic imagination. But the story spread widely at the time. Two respectable academics calmly claiming they had walked into the 1700s. It sounds like a Doctor Who episode written very politely. But it's part of documented early 20th century literature. Sometimes the human brain does very elaborate sightseeing. Now, let's drift into something even stranger. Early 1900s Germany. Meet Clever Hans. Hans was a horse. And not just any horse.
Hans could apparently do math.
His owner, Wilhelm von Osten, would ask questions like, "What is 3 plus 2? Hans would tap his hoof 5 times. Crowds gathered. Scientists were baffled. Newspapers were delighted. A horse that could add. Investigators tested Hans under controlled conditions. The horse continued to get answers correct. Eventually, psychologist Oscar Pfungst discovered the truth. Hans wasn't doing math. He was reading subtle body language cues. When Hans tapped his hoof, the audience would unconsciously tense as he approached the correct number. Slight changes in posture, facial expression, breathing. Hans picked up on these cues and stopped tapping at the right moment. He wasn't calculating. He was observing. The phenomenon became known as the Clever Hans effect, a reminder that subjects can unconsciously respond to cues from researchers. which is honestly still relevant today. The horse wasn't a mathematician, but he was very good at reading vibes. Now, let's float back to medieval Europe, specifically 16th century Basel, Switzerland. In 1518, yes, the same year as the Dancing Plague, Basel experienced something different. Authorities passed laws attempting to regulate laughter and excessive joy during certain religious observances. Now, this was not a full citywide ban on happiness. But there were moments in early modern Europe where authorities viewed uncontrolled laughter or revelry as morally dangerous. In some Puritan communities later on, similar attempts were made to regulate celebrations, theater, and even Christmas festivities. The idea was that joy, if not carefully supervised, might lead to sin, which feels exhausting. Imagine being fined for chuckling too enthusiastically. History has occasionally tried to micromanage vibes. Now, let's drift towards something quietly unsettling. In 1943, during World War II, a British woman named Joan Pujol Garcia, actually Spanish, began one of the most bizarre espionage careers in history. Pujol, codenamed Garbo by the British, worked as a double agent. He convinced the Germans that he was running a vast network of spies in Britain. The network did not exist. He fabricated dozens of fictional agents, created detailed backstories, wrote long reports. The Germans paid him, promoted him. His fake network provided crucial misinformation before the D-Day invasion, helping convince Germany that the real invasion would occur elsewhere. After the war, Pujol faked his own death and moved to Venezuela. He later resurfaced in the 1980s. It sounds like an elaborate screenplay, but it's a documented part of World War II intelligence. Sometimes history wins wars with paperwork and imagination. Now, let's gently move into ancient Egypt, because no strange list is complete without mummies. In the 19th century, Egyptian mummies were used in some creative ways. There are documented accounts of mummy unwrapping parties in Victorian England. Wealthy hosts would invite guests to watch the ceremonial unwrapping of an ancient body, because apparently dinner parties needed more drama. Even stranger, ground-up mummy was once used as medicine. Mumia was believed to have healing properties. It was sold in European apothecaries, which means people were casually ingesting powdered ancient Egyptians. It sounds deeply disrespectful. It was also very real. Human curiosity has not always paired well with restraint. Now, let's glide towards something quietly heroic. In 1917, during World War I, a soldier named Henry Johnson fought off a German raiding party almost entirely alone. Johnson was part of the Harlem Hellfighters, an African-American regiment serving with French forces due to segregation in the U.S. military. During a night raid, Johnson was on guard duty when German soldiers attacked. He fought back with a rifle, then a knife, protecting his wounded comrade. He sustained 21 wounds. The French awarded him the Croix de Guerre. But the United States did not fully recognize his bravery until decades later. Johnson died in poverty in 1929. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor in 2015. History sometimes takes its time correcting itself. Now, let's end this part with something deeply mundane and yet oddly cosmic. In 1977, the same year Voyager launched, something else happened.
The wow
signal. An astronomer named Jerry Emin was reviewing radio telescope data when he noticed a strong, unusual signal from space. He circled it on the printout and wrote "wow" in the margin. The signal lasted 72 seconds. It has never been explained. It has never been repeated. Was it extraterrestrial? A natural phenomenon? A rare interference event? No one knows. It was just there, for a minute and 12 seconds, and then gone. Sometimes history isn't just about what happened. It's about what almost happened. or what briefly flickered and vanished. Take a slow breath. We've walked through time slips and psychic horses. We've watched cities regulate laughter. We've seen spies invent entire imaginary armies. We've powdered mummies and misread radio signals. Every single one of these facts sounds fictional, but they're not. They're simply human. And humans have always been slightly unbelievable. We have one final stretch ahead. Part 8 will gently bring us home. Part 8. Lightning, assassins, and the quiet absurdity of being human.
All right.
This is it. The last soft stretch of our long, meandering stroll through histories. Are you absolutely sure? Folder. If you're still awake, I admire your stamina. If you've drifted in and out and only caught phrases like math horse and powdered mummy, that's also fine. That's kind of the point. Let's begin with the man who seems to have had a personal disagreement with lightning. Meet Roy Sullivan. Roy was a park ranger in Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. A calm job. Trees. Birds. Occasional tourists asking where the restroom is. Between 1942 and 1977, Roy Sullivan was struck by lightning 7 times.
7.
Now, being struck once is rare. Twice is extraordinary. 7 times begins to feel like atmospheric targeting. The strikes burned his hair, injured his shoulder, singed his eyebrows. At one point, lightning set his hair on fire, and he reportedly kept a can of water in his truck to douse himself just in case. Other park rangers became nervous around him during storms. People allegedly avoided standing too close. He survived all 7 strikes. He eventually died in 1983, not from lightning, but from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The lightning, apparently, was not what got him. It sounds like folklore, a tall tale told at campfires, but it's recorded in the Guinness World Records. Sometimes nature just picks someone and says, "You again." Now, let's gently pivot to someone who survived not nature but politics. King Zog I of Albania.
Yes. Zog.
Zog was king from 1928 to 1939. Before that, he was prime minister. Albania in the early 20th century was politically lively. Zog survived multiple assassination attempts. In 1931, while visiting Vienna, he was ambushed outside the opera house. He reportedly drew his own pistol and fired back at his attackers, which is a very dramatic way to exit a performance. Throughout his reign, there were repeated plots against him. Some accounts claim over 50 attempts on his life, though exact numbers vary. He often carried a gun, even inside his palace. Eventually, when Italy invaded Albania in 1939, Zog fled the country with his wife, Queen Geraldine, and their newborn son. He lived in exile for the rest of his life. He sounds like a fictional Balkan monarch invented for a slightly chaotic Netflix series. But he was real, and apparently had very quick reflexes. Now, let's drift into something softer. In 1888, a woman named Annie Edson Taylor decided she would go over Niagara Falls in a barrel. She was 63 years old. She had worked as a teacher, struggled financially, wanted fame and stability. So she had a custom barrel built, padded the interior. On October 24th, 1901, her birthday, she climbed inside and was sent over the falls. The drop is about 167 feet. She survived. Bruised, shaken, but alive. She was the first person to intentionally go over Niagara Falls and live. Unfortunately, fame did not bring wealth. Her manager ran off with the barrel. She spent years trying to recover it, which feels like insult added to concussion. Still, at 63, she climbed into a barrel and trusted gravity. That's commitment. Now, let's gently wander back to ancient times. In 365 CE, a massive earthquake struck near Crete. It triggered a tsunami across the Mediterranean. In Alexandria, Egypt, the sea reportedly withdrew dramatically before returning as a towering wave. Ancient historian Ammianus Marcellinus described ships being carried inland and left stranded on rooftops. The event reshaped coastlines. It sounds biblical, but geological evidence confirms it. The Earth occasionally reminds humanity that it was here first. Now, let's soften again. In 1963, a postal worker named James Warson in England claimed he could run extremely fast. Friends doubted him, so they followed him in a car as he ran along a road to prove his speed. According to reports, Warson suddenly stumbled and disappeared. No body was ever found. Now, before your sleepy brain spirals into mystery mode, most historians consider this likely folklore or a journalistic exaggeration that gained traction. But it was reported in newspapers, and it entered collections of strange but documented cases. History sometimes blurs at the edges. Not everything is cleanly resolved. Now, let's close our long wandering story with something oddly reassuring. In 1972, a man named Vesna Vulovic, a Serbian flight attendant, survived a fall from over 33,000 feet. Her plane exploded midair due to a bomb. She was trapped in part of the fuselage, which fell through the sky and landed on a snow-covered mountainside. She survived with multiple fractures. She holds the record for the highest fall survived without a parachute. It sounds like a myth. It is documented. Doctors attributed her survival to a combination of luck, snow cushioning, and the structure of the wreckage. Sometimes survival is not heroic or strategic. It is simply improbable. And yet it happens.
Now,
Let's take one final slow breath together. Over these many quiet hours, we've met a king undone by inbreeding, an emperor who fought the ocean, a city that drowned in molasses, a horse who almost convinced the world he could do algebra, a polar bear fishing in the Thames, a man struck by lightning 7 times, a spy who invented an entire imaginary army, a woman who trusted a barrel with her life, and a golden record drifting beyond the solar system. Every single one of these stories sounds like someone exaggerated at a dinner party. But they are real. History is not neat. It is not orderly. It is not logical. It is a collection of humans improvising. Sometimes brilliantly. Sometimes disastrously. Sometimes while being chased by emus. And there's something strangely comforting in that. The world has always been slightly absurd. People have always been slightly dramatic. Governments have always made odd decisions. Scientists have always poked storms with metal rods. And yet, we're still here. So as you drift off tonight, maybe let that thought settle in. If history has survived corpse trials, umbrella assassins, and soda with cocaine in it, you can survive tomorrow's email. Thank you for wandering through these strange, true stories with me. Dim the lights. Let your thoughts slow. And I'll see you next time.
good night.
Part 9. The Afterglow of Absurdity.
All right.
You're still here, which means either you're deeply invested in historical improbability, or this has become extremely effective background noise. Both are victories. Now, technically, we've already covered our promised 10 facts. And then some. And then many more because history does not understand moderation. But before we completely drift away, let's let this strangeness settle. Let's stretch this final quiet hour with a few more truths that sound suspiciously fictional. Because the world, historically speaking, has never once tried to behave normally. Let's begin in 1859. A quiet late summer day. Until the sky caught fire. The Carrington event. On September 1st, British astronomer Richard Carrington observed an enormous solar flare through his telescope. Within hours, Earth's magnetic field went mildly chaotic. Telegraph systems across Europe and North America began sparking. Operators received electric shocks. Paper caught fire. Some telegraph systems continued functioning even after being disconnected from power, running purely on geomagnetic current. Auroras were visible near the equator. People in Cuba and Hawaii reported red skies glowing bright enough to read newspapers at midnight. Imagine stepping outside, and the sky is simply glowing. In 1859, this was awe-inspiring. If it happened today, it would likely fry satellites and collapse power grids. It sounds apocalyptic, but it was just the sun having a dramatic moment. Now, let's drift somewhere gentler.
To Japan.
To a samurai who became a cat enthusiast. In the Edo period, Japan had strict social hierarchies. Samurai were warriors, disciplined, formal. But one historical figure, Lord Tsunetaka, is associated with the origin of the famous Maneki-Neko, the beckoning cat statue. Legend says Nataka was passing a temple during a storm when he saw a cat raising its paw as if waving him inside. Curious, he approached. Moments later, lightning struck where he had been standing. The cat saved him. In gratitude, he funded the temple. The beckoning cat became a symbol of good luck. Now, was it precisely this sequence of events? Legends shift gently over time, but the Maneki-Neko tradition traces back to these stories, which means that somewhere in early modern Japan, a warrior aristocrat decided a polite cat gesture had altered destiny. And honestly, that's wholesome. Now, let's move to something quietly mathematical. In 1999, NASA lost the Mars Climate Orbiter. The spacecraft had successfully traveled millions of miles to reach Mars. And then it vanished.
Why?
Because one engineering team used metric units. Another used imperial units. Newtons versus pound force. The mismatch caused a miscalculation in trajectory. The orbiter entered Mars's atmosphere at the wrong angle and was destroyed. A $125 million spacecraft lost because someone forgot to convert units. It sounds like a sitcom plot written by physics majors. But it's documented. Human error has range. Now, let's gently float back in time. To 1184 BC, the fall of Troy. For centuries, many scholars believed the Trojan War was myth, a poetic exaggeration from Homer's Iliad. Then in the 19th century, archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann excavated a site in modern-day Turkey and uncovered layers of an ancient city. Evidence suggested a violent destruction around the right time period. Was it exactly as Homer described? Probably not. There were likely no invincible warriors dipped in magic rivers. But a real city, a real conflict, a real destruction. Sometimes legends are embroidered truth. History doesn't always lie. It just dramatizes. Now, let's soften the mood again. In 1974, a farmer in China was digging a well. Instead of water, he uncovered pieces of clay. More digging revealed thousands of life-sized terracotta soldiers. The Terracotta Army, built to guard the tomb of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. Each soldier uniquely detailed. Faces different. Hairstyles distinct. They stood buried for over 2,000 years. Imagine casually digging in your field and discovering an underground army. It sounds like a fantasy novel opening chapter. But it was just Tuesday for farmer in Shaanxi. History is patient. It waits quietly underground. Now, let's end with something almost poetic. In 1914, during World War I, something unexpected happened on Christmas Eve. Along parts of the Western Front, soldiers from opposing sides, British and German, began singing carols. Voices carried across no man's land. Some units spontaneously declared informal truces. They met in the middle, shook hands, exchanged small gifts, played football. The war did not end. Commanders were furious. But for a brief moment, enemies lowered their weapons. It sounds sentimental, possibly embellished, but letters from soldiers confirm it. Even in the middle of mechanized horror, people paused. History is not only strange, it is also deeply human.
Now,
Let's breathe. Over the course of this long, winding, gently absurd journey, we've encountered facts that feel invented, but none of them were. The world has always been slightly surreal. Kings have exploded from overeating. Presidents have held seances. Birds have defeated armies. Lightning has picked favorites. And somewhere in deep space, a golden record carries Chuck Berry toward eternity. You don't need to exaggerate history. It already reads like fiction. So, as you drift fully into sleep now, let that be the final thought. Reality has always been stranger than it sounds. And tomorrow will likely add another quietly unbelievable footnote. Thank you for wandering through it with me.
good night.
Really this time. Part 10. The quiet aftermath of impossible things.
All right.
We've arrived at the final stretch. Not because history has ended, spoiler. It never does, but because our long, slow, slightly absurd journey through the unbelievable is gently winding down. If your eyelids are starting to feel pleasantly heavy, that's exactly the point. Let's let these last few stories drift over you like the calm, repetitive tick of a grandfather clock. Let's start with something elegantly improbable. In 1911, an archaeologist named Howard Carter was digging in Egypt. He had spent years fruitlessly searching for the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun. Then, one day, in the Valley of the Kings, he found it. It was intact, almost untouched for over 3,000 years. Inside, there were treasures beyond imagination, gold masks, intricately carved furniture, chariots, jewelry, even games and board pieces. Every artifact meticulously preserved. The discovery is remarkable in itself. But here's the gentle oddity. The world had been aware of Egyptian tombs for centuries. Yet somehow, a single boy king's tomb had been overlooked entirely. The treasures were so dazzling that the media at the time spun rumors of a curse. People whispered that those who disturbed Tutankhamun would die mysteriously. Scientists later explained these deaths with ordinary causes. But the legend persisted. It feels like the sort of thing you'd read in a Gothic novel. But it is entirely factual. Reality simply doesn't need embellishment. Now, let's float to Europe again. In 1795, a French general named Jean-Baptiste Kleber was assassinated in Cairo. His killer stabbed him with a dagger. But what makes this almost absurdly procedural is the response of the local authorities. After the murder, the assassin was captured, tried, and executed promptly. Normal, right? But here's the twist. Kleber's body was embalmed, placed in a coffin, and shipped back to France. For months, it traveled hundreds of miles by camel and boat, arriving in Paris for a grand state funeral. The image is quietly surreal. A body traveling across deserts and seas like a VIP traveler, receiving honors along the way. No supernatural forces, no dramatic battles. Just logistics, embalming, and dignity. History often hums like a mechanical clock, orderly and slow, but occasionally absurd if you look closely. Now, something more modern and unexpectedly poetic. In 1980, the Voyager 1 spacecraft passed Saturn. Among the data, it recorded sounds, the movement of charged particles around the planet, magnetic fields shifting, and eerie, musical tones. At the time, scientists played the audio in laboratories. It sounded almost like wind or the soft sigh of an alien orchestra. Voyager is still traveling outward, carrying the golden record, silently documenting the universe as it drifts. Millions of miles away, it captures echoes no human has ever heard in person. It's comforting in a strange way to think that history is not only made by humans but is also quietly happening in the cosmos. Let's close with a gentle human anecdote. In 1930, a man named Albert Einstein was traveling by train. Someone asked him for a simple explanation of relativity. He reportedly leaned back, smiled faintly, and said, "Put your hand on a hot stove for a minute, and it feels like an hour. Sit with a pretty girl for an hour, and it feels like a minute." That's relativity. Simple. Almost silly, but perfectly true. History doesn't always need wars, assassinations, or exploding coffins to feel profound. Sometimes it's captured in a quiet, human observation. Take a slow, long breath. We've now wandered from exploding molasses to atomic bombs, from kingly diets to lightning strikes, from clever horses to golden records drifting past Neptune. We've dipped into absurdities, near miracles, legends, and factual oddities. And through it all, the thread is the same. Humans, animals, nature, and even stars can produce events that feel almost fictional, but are, in fact, entirely real. So as you drift fully toward sleep, let your mind float through centuries of gentle absurdity. Let these improbable truths settle softly, like snow on rooftops, like the faint hum of a distant clock, like a whispered bedtime story from the universe itself. History is stranger than fiction, and somehow that makes it a perfectly soothing companion for the night.
Good night.
Really, this time,